Margaret Thompson adjusted her white apron one final time before pushing through the heavy kitchen doors. The Pentagon's executive dining room buzzed with the low murmur of military conversation, the clink of silverware against fine china, and the occasional rustle of classified documents being discreetly shuffled aside to make room for lunch plates. At 62, Margaret moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades serving others. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her sensible shoes made barely a whisper against the polished marble floor. To most people in the room, she was invisible, just another member of the support staff who kept the wheels of the military machine turning. She had been working at the Pentagon for 3 years now, ever since her husband's death had left her alone in their small Virginia apartment with bills to pay and too many quiet hours to fill. The job paid well enough, and she found comfort in the routine. Serve lunch to the brass, clean up, go home. Simple, predictable, safe. Today's lunch was for a gathering of high-ranking officers from multiple branches. Margaret had seen the guest list earlier, a collection of stars and eagles that would have impressed her younger self. Now, they were just customers who preferred their coffee black and their conversations confidential. She began with the table nearest the window, where 3 Army colonels were deep in discussion about supply chain logistics. They barely glanced up as she placed their plates before them, their conversation continuing as if she weren't there. Margaret had grown accustomed to this invisibility. In her experience, powerful people rarely noticed the help unless something went wrong. Moving methodically around the room, she served grilled salmon to a Navy admiral, chicken parmesan to an Air Force general, and a simple Caesar salad to a Marine colonel who was watching his cholesterol. Each interaction was brief, professional, and forgettable. The dining room's atmosphere was typical for these high-level gatherings. Conversations touched on budget allocations, personnel transfers, and strategic planning. Occasionally, someone would lower their voice when discussing something particularly sensitive, but for the most part, these officers were comfortable speaking freely in this secure environment. Margaret had heard countless such conversations over her 3 years here. Talk of deployments and rotations, equipment purchases and base closures. It all became background noise after a while, like the hum of air conditioning or the distant sound of traffic. She had learned early on that the key to keeping this job was to listen without hearing, to be present without being noticed. As she worked, Margaret's mind wandered to her evening plans. Her neighbor had invited her to a book club meeting, and she was considering going. Since Harold's death, she had been slowly trying to rebuild some semblance of a social life. The loneliness that had consumed her in those first months was beginning to fade, replaced by a quiet determination to find purpose in her remaining years. The job at the Pentagon had been a godsend in that regard. It gave her structure, a reason to get up each morning, and a paycheck that allowed her to maintain her independence. She had no desire to burden her adult children, who had their own lives and responsibilities in distant states. Returning to the kitchen for the dessert course, Margaret exchanged pleasantries with the other staff members. They were a diverse group, some career government employees, others like herself who had found their way here later in life. They shared the bond of the invisible workforce, the people who kept important institutions running while remaining largely unseen and unacknowledged. Back in the dining room, she began distributing dessert plates filled with chocolate mousse and fresh berries. The conversations had shifted to more personal topics now that the formal part of the meal was winding down. Someone was retiring next month. Another officer's daughter was getting married. A general was complaining good-naturedly about his golf game. Margaret smiled politely when appropriate and continued her work. She had one more table to serve, where a sharp-eyed lieutenant colonel sat reviewing a file while absently stirring his coffee. He was younger than most of the officers in the room, probably in his early 40s, with the lean build and alert posture of someone who had seen combat. As she approached his table, dessert plate in hand, Margaret noticed him glance up briefly. Unlike the others, his gaze lingered for just a moment longer than necessary. She set down his plate and moved to refill his water glass, thinking nothing of the brief exchange. What she didn't know was that Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison had a photographer's eye for detail, honed by years of intelligence work in some of the world's most dangerous places. He noticed things that others missed, the way someone held their shoulders, the significance of a worn wedding ring, the story told by small scars and careful movements. And he had definitely noticed something about the quiet woman serving dessert that didn't quite fit with her current role. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that had settled in his mind as he watched the woman clear the dessert plates. Something about her bearing, the way she carried herself with quiet dignity despite her humble position, reminded him of someone. Not a specific person, but a type he had encountered in his years of service. Someone who had seen things, done things, carried burdens that most people couldn't imagine. He tried to focus on the file in front of him, a routine intelligence briefing about supply routes in Eastern Europe, but his attention kept drifting back to the woman. She moved with purpose but without haste, her hands steady as she stacked plates and wiped down tables. There was something almost military in her efficiency. Morrison had spent enough time in war zones to recognize the subtle signs of someone who had been tested by fire. It was in the way she scanned each table before approaching, the slight pause before entering any new space, the unconscious positioning that kept her back to walls and exits in sight. These were habits ingrained by necessity, the kind that didn't fade even decades after they were learned. After lunch, as the officers began to disperse back to their various duties, Morrison found himself lingering. He pretended to review his notes while covertly observing the cleanup process. The woman, he had heard another staff member call her Margaret, worked systematically, but he noticed something else now that the room was quieter. She favored her left leg slightly, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't the stiff gait of arthritis or age, but the careful movement of someone compensating for an old injury. Morrison had seen similar patterns in veterans who had been wounded in combat, the way they learned to adapt and carry on despite permanent damage. More telling was what he observed when she bent to retrieve a dropped napkin. As her uniform jacket shifted, he caught a glimpse of something metallic pinned to the inside of her collar. It was small, easily missed, but Morrison's trained eye immediately recognized the distinctive star-shaped outline. His breath caught slightly as he processed what he had seen. The Silver Star, the third highest military decoration for valor in combat. Margaret finished her work, unaware that she was being watched with new interest. She had worn Harold's Silver Star every day since his funeral 3 years ago, pinned to the inside of her clothing where it rested close to her heart. It was her way of keeping him with her, of honoring the man who had saved 3 wounded soldiers in Vietnam and never talked about it afterward except in his nightmares. The medal had been presented to him 45 years after the fact, when one of the men he had saved became a congressman and pushed through the bureaucratic maze to ensure Harold received the recognition he deserved. By then, Harold was dying of cancer, and the ceremony at the local VFW hall was one of his last public appearances. As Margaret headed back to the kitchen, Morrison made a decision that would change everything. Instead of returning to his office, he followed at a discreet distance. He wasn't suspicious exactly. Security clearances for Pentagon staff were thorough, but his curiosity was fully aroused. In the kitchen, Margaret was finishing up her daily routine, washing the last of the serving utensils and preparing for the next day. She chatted quietly with Rosa, the head cook, about weekend plans and grocery store sales. It was comfortable, mundane conversation that helped ease the transition from work to solitude. Morrison waited until Margaret left the building, then used his security credentials to access the personnel database. What he found in Margaret Thompson's file was minimal but telling. Age 62. Widow. Previous employment, various part-time positions over the past 3 years. Before that, a gap of nearly 40 years with only homemaker listed as occupation. But it was the emergency contact information that made Morrison sit back in his chair with surprise. Margaret's maiden name was Margaret Sullivan, and according to the records, her late husband was Harold Thompson, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army, Vietnam veteran. Morrison pulled up Harold's military records, accessible through the Pentagon's database system. What he read made him whistle low under his breath. Harold Thompson had been a medic with the 1st Infantry Division. His record showed multiple commendations for bravery, including the Silver Star for extraordinary heroism in action against enemy forces. But there was more. Harold's wife was listed as Margaret Sullivan Thompson, and her own military service record was attached to the file. Morrison's eyebrows rose as he read. Margaret had served as a field nurse with the Army Medical Corps from 1969 to 1973, including 2 tours in Vietnam. She hadn't just been a homemaker for 40 years. She had been hiding in plain sight. Morrison printed out the relevant pages and sat back in his chair, mind racing. Margaret Thompson wasn't just any veteran. She was a nurse who had served in some of the heaviest fighting of the Vietnam War, in field hospitals and aid stations that came under regular enemy fire. The woman who had been serving him chocolate mousse had probably saved more lives than most of the generals in that dining room. But why was she working as a lunch server? Why hadn't she pursued a career with Veterans Affairs or used her military experience to secure a better position? As Morrison dug deeper into the records, a clearer picture began to emerge. Margaret's discharge papers showed she had left the service abruptly in 1973 with a medical notation that was still classified. Her subsequent employment history was sporadic: a few years as a civilian nurse, then long gaps, then part-time work in non-medical fields. Morrison recognized the pattern. It was common among veterans who had experienced significant trauma, especially those who had served in medical roles during heavy combat. They often struggled to readjust to civilian life, dealing with what was now called PTSD, but was then barely understood or acknowledged. As he closed the files, Morrison felt a mixture of anger and sadness. Here was a woman who had given years of her life in service to her country, who had undoubtedly saved countless lives under the most dangerous conditions imaginable, and she was invisible to the very military establishment she had served. Tomorrow, he decided, he would find a way to talk to Margaret Thompson, not as a customer in need of lunch service, but as one veteran speaking to another. Margaret arrived at work the next morning with the same quiet efficiency that had marked her routine for the past 3 years. She hung her jacket in her assigned locker, tied her apron, and reviewed the day's menu with Rosa. Today would be busier than usual, a joint meeting between Army and Navy procurement officers that would require service for nearly 50 people. As she prepared the dining room, arranging fresh flowers and checking each table's setting, Margaret allowed her mind to wander back to Vietnam. It had been happening more frequently lately, these unexpected journeys into the past. Perhaps it was the approaching anniversary of Harold's death, or maybe the recent conversation with her daughter about possibly moving to a retirement community. Whatever the trigger, the memories had become more vivid. She remembered the first time she had seen Harold, muddy and exhausted, as he carried a wounded soldier into her field hospital near Chu Lai. Even through the chaos and blood, she had noticed his gentle hands and the way he spoke softly to the injured men, keeping them calm while she worked to save their lives. They had worked together countless times after that, a seamless team in the face of horror. The sound of footsteps interrupted her reverie. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison appeared in the dining room earlier than usual and alone. Margaret straightened, automatically shifting into her professional demeanor. "Good morning, sir. The breakfast service doesn't begin for another hour, but I can get you coffee if you'd like." Morrison studied her face carefully, nodding the intelligent eyes and the way she held herself with unconscious military bearing. "Actually, Mrs. Thompson, I was hoping to speak with you if you have a moment." Margaret felt a flutter of unease. In 3 years of work here, no officer had ever asked to speak with her personally. "Of course, sir. Is there a problem with the service?" "No, nothing like that." Morrison gestured toward one of the tables. "Please sit down." Margaret remained standing. "I prefer to stand, sir. I'm on duty." Morrison smiled at her answer. It was exactly what he had expected. "Mrs. Thompson, I know you served as a field nurse in Vietnam from 1969 to 1973. I know your husband Harold received the Silver Star for his actions as a medic with the 1st Infantry Division, and I know that the medal you wear pinned inside your collar was his." The color drained from Margaret's face. For a moment, Morrison thought she might faint, but instead she sat down heavily in the nearest chair, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "How did you? My employment records don't include my military service." "They don't have to. Military records are cross-referenced in the Pentagon database. Mrs. Thompson, why didn't you tell anyone about your service when you applied for this position? You could have secured a much better job with your experience and credentials." Margaret was silent for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I wanted to forget. Because every time someone thanked me for my service, I remembered the ones I couldn't save. Because when people found out I had been in Vietnam, they looked at me differently." Morrison leaned forward. "What happened in 1973? Your discharge papers mention a medical reason, but the details are classified." Margaret looked up at him, and Morrison was startled by the pain he saw in her eyes. I was in a field hospital near Lock when it came under rocket attack, 3 direct hits. I was trapped under rubble for 6 hours with 2 wounded soldiers. One of them died while I held his hand. The other lost his leg because I couldn't get to my surgical instruments. She paused, her breathing shallow. When they finally pulled me out, I had a crushed vertebra and internal injuries, but the physical wounds healed, the other damage, that took longer. Morrison nodded with understanding. He had seen plenty of combat himself and recognized the symptoms of severe PTSD. Is that why you left nursing? I tried to go back. For about 2 years, I worked at a hospital in Baltimore. But every time I heard a helicopter or saw blood or lost a patient, I couldn't function. The panic attacks got worse. My supervisor suggested I find a different line of work. Margaret stood up abruptly. Sir, I need to prepare for the lunch service, if there's a problem with my employment here. There's no problem, Morrison interrupted gently. In fact, I think there's an opportunity. Are you familiar with the Pentagon's Veterans Affairs Liaison Program? Margaret shook her head. We've been looking for someone to help coordinate services for military families, particularly those dealing with trauma and adjustment issues. Someone who understands what veterans go through, not from textbooks but from experience. The position would involve counseling, advocacy, helping families navigate the system. Margaret stared at him in disbelief. You're offering me a job? Sir, I haven't done anything medical or counseling related in decades. I serve lunch. And you do it with dignity, compassion, and attention to detail that most people never notice. But I notice, Mrs. Thompson. Yesterday, I watched you automatically position yourself with clear sight lines to exits. I saw how you handled that minor crisis when the general's aide spilled coffee, calm, efficient, taking charge without making a scene. Those are the instincts of someone who has been tested under fire. Morrison pulled a business card from his pocket. I'm not asking you to decide right now, but I want you to think about it. There are a lot of veterans and military families who could benefit from talking to someone who's been where they are. Margaret took the card with trembling hands. Why are you doing this? You don't even know me. Because 3 years ago, when my unit was ambushed in Afghanistan, a Navy corpsman saved my life. She reminded me a lot of you, actually, quiet, competent, focused on the mission. She died 2 weeks later in another attack. Morrison's voice grew quiet. I've learned that you don't waste opportunities to help good people do good work. As Morrison stood to leave, Margaret found her voice. The Silver Star? It's not mine. It was Harold's. He saved 3 men in a firefight near Saigon, carried them out one by one while taking enemy fire. I read his citation, Morrison replied. But Mrs. Thompson, I also read yours. You were awarded the Bronze Star with V device for valor, the Purple Heart, and the Meritorious Service Medal. Your husband wasn't the only hero in your family. Margaret's hand went automatically to her throat, where another small medal was pinned inside her collar, one she had almost forgotten she wore. No one ever. No one ever recognized what you did, but that doesn't make it less important. Morrison headed toward the door, then turned back. The job pays twice what you're making now, has full benefits, and comes with an office instead of an apron. Think about it. As he left, Margaret sat alone in the dining room, surrounded by tables she would soon be setting for lunch. But for the first time in 3 years, she was seeing possibilities instead of just plates and silverware. Margaret spent the rest of that day moving through her duties in a fog of confusion and possibility. She served lunch to the procurement officers mechanically, her mind churning with Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's unexpected offer. During her break, she sat in the small employee lounge, turning his business card over and over in her hands. That evening, she called her daughter Sarah in California. They spoke every Sunday, but this was Thursday, and Sarah immediately sensed something was different in her mother's voice. Mom, you sound strange. Are you okay? Margaret found herself telling Sarah about the conversation with Morrison, about the job offer, about the recognition of her military service that she had kept hidden for so long. As she spoke, she heard her daughter's sharp intake of breath. Mom, you were in Vietnam. You never told us that. We knew Dad was there, but you. It wasn't something I wanted to remember, sweetheart. It was a different time. People didn't understand what women went through over there, especially nurses. When I came home, I just wanted to be normal, to be your mother and Dad's wife, nothing else. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Mom, what did you do over there? For the first time in decades, Margaret found herself talking about Vietnam. She told Sarah about the field hospitals, about working 18-hour shifts under enemy fire, about holding dying soldiers and writing letters to their families. She talked about the day she was wounded, about Harold finding her in the hospital and proposing to her right there in her recovery bed. "You saved lives," Sarah said softly. "Mom, you saved lives and we never knew. I lost some too, that's what I remember most. But think about how many families got their sons back because of you. Think about the soldiers who lived to have children and grandchildren because you were there." After hanging up, Margaret sat in her quiet apartment, surrounded by photos of her life with Harold and their children. For so many years, she had defined herself by her failures in Vietnam, the patients she couldn't save, the moment when her nerve finally broke, the way she had fled from her calling. But Sarah's words had planted a seed of possibility. The next day, Margaret found herself paying closer attention to the conversations around her at work. She overheard a young Marine's wife talking to a friend about her husband's nightmares, about how she didn't know how to help him. She listened to a general mention his concern for a soldier in his command who was struggling with depression after multiple deployments. During lunch, Morrison appeared again, this time with another officer Margaret didn't recognize, a woman about her own age wearing Navy commander's stripes. "Mrs. Thompson," Morrison said, "I'd like you to meet Commander Patricia Hayes. She runs the Veterans Affairs Liaison program I mentioned yesterday." Commander Hayes studied Margaret with intelligent, kind eyes. "Colonel Morrison tells me you might be interested in joining our team. I have to admit, when he first told me about you, I was skeptical. Then I read your military records." Margaret felt her cheeks flush. "Commander, I appreciate the interest, but I haven't worked in any professional capacity in decades. I'm not sure I'm qualified." "Mrs. Thompson, last week I had a young Marine wife call our office in tears. Her husband had been home from his third deployment for 6 months, but he couldn't sleep, couldn't handle crowds, couldn't connect with their children. She asked me if I had ever felt the ground shake from incoming mortars, if I had ever held a dying 19-year-old boy while he cried for his mother. I had to tell her no." Hayes paused, letting the words sink in. "You could have told her yes, and that would have made all the difference." Margaret looked back and forth between the two officers. What exactly would this job involve? "Counseling military families dealing with trauma and adjustment issues," Hayes explained. "Helping veterans navigate the benefits system, advocating for better services, training civilian counselors about military culture and combat stress. You'd be working with people who are where you were 40 years ago. And you think I'm qualified for this because I fell apart?" Morrison leaned forward. "Mrs. Thompson, you didn't fall apart. You were wounded in combat both physically and psychologically, and you survived. You rebuilt your life. You raised children and maintained a marriage and found ways to keep serving, even if it was just serving lunch. That's not falling apart, that's resilience." Hayes pulled out a folder. "We'd like to offer you a trial period. 3 months, during which you'd shadow our current staff, receive training in modern counseling techniques, and gradually take on your own caseload. Your military experience would be invaluable, but we'd also give you the tools to help people in ways that go beyond shared experience." Margaret took the folder but didn't open it. "Can I ask you something? How many women like me have you worked with? Women who served in Vietnam as nurses or medics?" "Honestly, very few. Most of them, like you, disappeared into civilian life after the war. Many never sought recognition for their service or benefits they were entitled to. You represent a forgotten piece of military history." That afternoon, Margaret made an excuse to leave work early. Instead of going home, she drove to Arlington National Cemetery. She hadn't been there since Harold's funeral, but she needed to be somewhere that felt sacred, somewhere that honored sacrifice. She walked among the white headstones, thinking about all the young faces she had seen in Vietnam, both the living and the dead. She thought about Harold, about his quiet heroism, and the way he had helped her heal after the war. She thought about the Marine wife who was struggling to understand her husband's demons. At Harold's grave, she sat on the grass and spoke to him for the first time since his funeral. "I don't know if I can do this, honey. I don't know if I'm strong enough to go back to that world, even to help people. What if I break again?" The wind stirred the trees above her, and Margaret remembered something Harold had said during one of his rare moments of talking about the war. "The bravest thing isn't not being afraid. It's being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway." She opened the folder Commander Hayes had given her. Inside was a detailed job description, salary information, and a list of the current caseload. 43 active cases, ranging from new veterans struggling with civilian life to military families dealing with deployment stress to older veterans finally seeking help for trauma they had carried for decades. At the bottom of the file was a note in Hayes's handwriting. Margaret, these people need someone who understands their language, someone who has walked their path. They need someone who has been broken and found a way to heal. They need you. Margaret sat in the cemetery until sunset, surrounded by the honored dead, making one of the most important decisions of her life. When she finally stood to leave, she knew what she had to do. The next morning, she arrived at work early and found Morrison in the dining room, reading intelligence reports over coffee. "Colonel Morrison," she said, approaching his table with her usual professional demeanor. He looked up expectantly. "I'll take the job," she said simply, "but I have one condition." Morrison raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Margaret reached inside her collar and unpinned both medals, Harold's Silver Star and her own Bronze Star. For the first time in 3 years, she pinned them to the outside of her uniform, where they caught the morning light streaming through the windows. "I want to wear these where people can see them. I'm tired of hiding what I am." Morrison smiled. "I think that can be arranged, Counselor Thompson." 6 months later, Margaret Thompson sat in her new office on the second floor of the Pentagon, looking over case files for the day ahead. The office was small but comfortable, with a window overlooking the inner courtyard and walls displaying her military decorations alongside her new counseling certifications. The transformation from lunch server to veteran affairs counselor had been challenging, but deeply rewarding. Her first case that morning was Jessica Martinez, a young Army wife whose husband had returned from Afghanistan 3 months earlier. Jessica sat across from Margaret's desk, dark circles under her eyes, hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "He won't talk to me about what happened over there," Jessica said. "He just sits in the garage working on the car, drinking beer, avoiding the kids. When I try to get him to come to family dinners or school events, he gets angry and says I don't understand." Margaret nodded, remembering her own struggles with Harold after Vietnam. "Jessica, can I tell you something about my own experience?" Over the past 6 months, Margaret had learned to use her own story strategically, sharing pieces of her past when they could help someone else navigate their present. She told Jessica about Harold's nightmares, about the way he had struggled to connect with their young children after the war, about the patience and understanding it had taken to help him heal. "Your husband is carrying experiences that are hard to put into words," Margaret explained. "In combat, soldiers learn to compartmentalize emotions in order to survive. Coming home means learning to open those compartments safely. It takes time and it takes support." Jessica leaned forward. "But how do I help him if he won't talk to me?" "Sometimes the talking comes later. Right now, just being consistently present and patient is helping more than you know. Would you be interested in joining our support group for military spouses? You'd meet other women going through similar challenges." As Jessica left with information about the support group and a follow-up appointment scheduled, Margaret felt the familiar satisfaction that came with making a genuine connection. This was so different from serving lunch, where she had been invisible and unacknowledged. Here, her presence mattered. Her experience had value. Her next appointment was with Staff Sergeant David Chen, a Marine who had lost his leg to an IED in Iraq 2 years earlier. David was struggling with depression and had been referred to Margaret by his medical team. "They tell me you were in Vietnam," David said without preamble. "What's it supposed to matter? You weren't infantry, you weren't getting shot at." Margaret had heard variations of this challenge before, particularly from combat veterans who assumed that medical personnel had somehow had an easier war. She had learned not to take it personally. "You're right," she said calmly. "I wasn't infantry, but I was in field hospitals that came under rocket and mortar attack. I treated soldiers who had been shot, blown up, burned. I held dying 19-year-olds while they called for their mothers. I was wounded in combat and decorated for valor under fire." David's expression shifted slightly. "I didn't know that." "Most people don't. For a long time, I preferred it that way. I spent 40 years trying to forget what I had seen and done over there. But I've learned that our experiences, even the painful ones, can have value if we use them to help others." Over the course of the hour, Margaret helped David explore his feelings about his injury and his future. She shared techniques for managing depression and anxiety that she had learned both from her own experience and from her recent training. By the end of the session, David was talking about possibly returning to school to study engineering. During her lunch break, eaten now in her office rather than the kitchen, Margaret reviewed the letter she had received that morning from the Marine wife, who had been Commander Hayes's first example of their need for someone like Margaret. After 3 months of counseling and participation in the spousal support group, the woman had written to thank Margaret for helping save her marriage. "For the first time since my husband came home," the letter read, "I felt like someone understood what we were going through. When you told me about your own husband's struggles after Vietnam, I realized that what we were experiencing was normal. It could be survived. Thank you for giving me hope." Margaret kept such letters in a special file. On difficult days, when a case wasn't progressing well or when her own memories threatened to overwhelm her, she would read them and remember why this work mattered. Her afternoon was devoted to training civilian counselors about military culture and combat trauma. Margaret had discovered an unexpected talent for teaching, perhaps because her own journey from trauma to healing gave her credibility with audiences who might otherwise be skeptical of academic theories about PTSD. "The most important thing to understand," she told the group of 12 counselors gathered in the conference room, "is that military service creates a different relationship with mortality, responsibility, and brotherhood. Civilians often try to help veterans by encouraging them to put the war behind them or move on. But for many veterans, the war isn't something they did, it's something they are." One of the counselors raised her hand. "How do you help them integrate that identity with civilian life?" Margaret smiled. "You don't help them forget they were soldiers. You help them understand that being a soldier prepared them for other forms of service. Combat veterans have skills that translate to civilian leadership, crisis management, teaching, mentoring. The goal isn't to erase their military identity, but to expand it." After the training session, Margaret returned to her office to find Lieutenant Colonel Morrison waiting for her. He had become something of a mentor over the past months, checking in periodically to see how she was adjusting to her new role. "How are you settling in?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Better than I expected," Margaret replied honestly. "I was afraid that being around trauma and military families would trigger my own issues. Instead, I found that helping others has been healing for me too." Morrison nodded. "That's not uncommon. Sometimes the best way to process our own experiences is to use them in service of others." He pulled out a manila folder. "I have something for you. Remember when I told you that most women who served as nurses and medics in Vietnam disappeared into civilian life after the war?" Margaret nodded. "Well, Commander Hayes and I have been working on a project to identify and reach out to some of those women. We've found 12 so far who live in the D.C. area. We're organizing a reunion of sorts, and we'd like you to help coordinate it." Margaret opened the folder to find photos and brief biographies of 12 women, all around her age, all with similar stories of service, trauma, and quiet resilience. Some had found success in civilian careers, others had struggled with the same issues that had derailed Margaret's nursing career decades earlier. "Some of them have never talked about their service," Morrison continued. "Others have been fighting for recognition and benefits for years. We thought bringing them together might be powerful for everyone involved." As Margaret studied the faces in the photographs, she felt a surge of emotion. For so long, she had believed she was alone in her experience, that her struggle to reconcile her wartime service with her civilian life was somehow unique. To see these other faces, to read their stories, was both heartbreaking and hopeful. "When do we start?" she asked. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood in the Pentagon's officer club, watching as 12 women who had served as nurses, medics, and support personnel in Vietnam met each other for the first time. The reunion had drawn participants from as far away as Oregon and Florida, women who had traveled across the country for the chance to connect with others who shared their unique experience. Margaret watched as connections formed quickly around the room. Here were women talking openly about experiences they had kept hidden for decades, sharing stories of valor and trauma, loss and survival. For the first time, they were not alone with their memories. As the evening wound down, one of the women, a former surgical nurse named Linda who now lived in retirement in Florida, approached Margaret. "Thank you for organizing this," Linda said. "I never thought I'd meet anyone who understood what it was like over there, not just the medical stuff, but the whole experience of being a woman in that war." Margaret smiled. "Actually, this wasn't my idea, but I'm glad we could make it happen." Linda studied Margaret's face. "You know, when I first got the invitation, I almost didn't come. I've spent so many years trying to forget Vietnam, trying to be normal. But being here tonight, talking to all of you, I realize that maybe forgetting isn't the answer." "What do you think the answer is?" Margaret asked. Linda gestured around the room where small groups of women were still deep in conversation, sharing photos and contact information. "This, connection, using what we learned to help others, remembering that what we did mattered." As Margaret drove home that night, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from invisible lunch server to recognized veteran and counselor. The transformation hadn't erased her scars or eliminated her struggles with the memories of Vietnam, but it had given those experiences meaning and purpose. She thought about Harold, about the way he had supported her decision to leave nursing after the war, never pushing her to return to a profession that had become too painful to bear. She wondered what he would think of her new career, of her willingness to walk back into the world of military trauma and healing. At a red light, she touched the medals pinned to her jacket, Harold's silver star and her own bronze star, worn now with pride rather than hidden in shame. She had learned that healing wasn't about forgetting or hiding from the past, but about finding ways to transform pain into purpose. The next morning, Margaret arrived at her office to find a note slipped under her door. It was from Jessica Martinez, the young Army wife who had been her first client. "Dear Mrs. Thompson," the note read, "I wanted to let you know that my husband started talking last night, really talking for the first time since he came home. He told me about his experiences in Afghanistan, about the friends he lost, about why he's been so afraid to get close to us kids. It wasn't easy to hear, but I finally understand. Thank you for teaching me how to be patient, how to create space for him to heal. Thank you for showing me that it's possible to come home from war, even when it takes time." Margaret pinned the note to her bulletin board next to the photos from the veterans' reunion and her counseling certifications. Each piece of paper represented a life touched, a connection made, a step toward healing. She had spent 3 years serving lunch to generals and admirals, invisible in her white apron and sensible shoes. But it had taken a sharp-eyed officer recognizing the significance of a small metal star to reveal who she really was, not just a lunch server, but a veteran, a healer, and a woman who had found a way to transform her own wounds into wisdom for others. As she prepared for her first appointment of the day, Margaret Thompson smiled. She had finally come home from the war,